I have a question. You said you converted to anarcho-capitalism. How would anarcho-capitalism actually deal with the prisoner's dilemma, where in the state you kind of force people to do things against their interests, but without the state, how do you, like everybody wants someone to be at the border to fight Hezbollah, but nobody actually wants to leave their house. Everyone would like other people to be tested for corona so they don't get sick, but they might not want to do it themselves. Everybody wants other people not to litter, but the trash can is very far away. How do you deal with the prisoner's dilemma without a state?
Okay, that's a very good, good challenging question. How would anarcho-capitalism deal with all these issues? How would you compel people to do stuff? Well, look, we're not pacifists. Us anarcho-capitalists, we're not pacifists. If somebody hits me, I'm not going to turn the other cheek. I'm going to, try to hit him back. So we anarcho-capitalists believe in using force and compulsion, but only in defense, not initiatory. So how would it work? Let's say an ordinary criminal. If I owned a shopping mall or a hotel or a street, and one of my articles is that all the streets and roads should be privatized. If I own one, what I would do is I would make a contract with a defense agency, the police, a private police company. And a private police company would stop the rapes, and it would stop people speeding on my road, and it would stop all sorts of mishigas. And, so the way we would do that is through private police departments. And private police departments, I think, would be more efficient than government ones. And it would be the same thing with a national police. We would hire the police to keep enemies from the country. And when I was at graduate school, I had a whole bunch of Israeli students. Does anyone know Reuben Gronau? He's a professor at Hebrew University, and I had a whole bunch of Israeli students. The interesting thing is that my understanding is that in Israel, I went to a liberal arts college, and you take a little of economics, a little of philosophy, a little this, a little that. The Israelis, all they had was math and statistics and economics. The ones who were in graduate school with me, and I used to say, well, how would we get an Israeli army if we didn't have the government to draft people into it? And my answer was that any able-bodied person who didn't have a little sign showing that he was in the military, nobody would serve him. Nobody would, you go into a store and they're not going to, you would be just boycotted by everybody. So I think that without Israel having a draft, people would volunteer. So I'm against a draft. I think we could get a volunteer military. Well, how would they get money to hire the soldiers? Well, the same way that private policemen would get soldiers, namely all the private police groups in Israel or in whatever country, it doesn't matter, would get together and have not only small arms for fighting local criminals, and there are local criminals, but also to hire, airplanes or missiles or whatever it is you need to fight a military. So I think you would be able to get a military. The question is, would it be more efficient or less efficient? And I think government is always less efficient than the market. So we would have a better military without the government. I think we'd have a better everything else than without the government. Now, look, I'm not attacking the Israeli government. A lot of people say, well, the Israeli government is much worse than any other government. I don't think Israeli government is worse than any other government. I'm just against all governments. And I think the Israeli people would be more powerful if they got rid of the government. But this isn't really, what do you call it? Something that we have to advocate right now. We have other problems. So I wouldn't put it on the top of my wish list. But I as an anarcho-capitalist, I would say that the government is not only unjustified because it uses compulsion against innocent people, but it's also less efficient. So that would be my response to you. But thanks for the very important question.
I want to disagree about something. If you can hear me, you can hear me?
I can hear you. Yeah, shoot.
Okay. Like you said, if you have like a military, it should, like, how can the military defend only with the ones who are paying? Isn't the military like a public service in its main core?
You know, I do marathon races. And in a marathon race, you have to pay $50 or $80 or something. And they give you a little thing on your t-shirt, a bib. Any of you guys race? Did they have races like that in Israel? 5K, 10K races? No?
Yeah. We do.
You've seen the Boston Marathon, the New York Marathon. There'll be 20,000 people and they all have to pay $50. Well, how do you keep the goyim out? How do you keep the non-payers out? Well, you issue people a little tag, and if they don't have that little tag, they get arrested for theft of services. Well, it'd be the same thing here. If you're protected, if you pay to a a private police force, you get a little ticket. And it doesn't have to be, it could be an electronic ticket. And if somebody is bothering you and you haven't paid, the police aren't going to help you. Or take firemen. We also want to have private fire protection. And you dirty rat, you don't pay the fire company. And now your house is on fire. And or the fire is starting and you desperately call the fire department to come and help you. And you know what the fire department will say? Well, ordinarily for most people, it's $100 a year. But for you, a special deal, since you didn't pay before, $10,000. And this would this would give people incentive to pay the fire department, to pay the police department. Because if you don't, they're not going to protect you.
Like, I'm not talking about a fire department or police department. So I'm talking about a whole army, like defending a border.
Well, it would be the same thing. First of all, if you didn't pay the local police, they wouldn't protect you. So you'd have a good incentive to pay the local police. But all the military would be is all the local police forces get together and have a military. So the local police force would have small arms to protect against local criminals. But then suppose in Israel there were an industry of 10 police departments, private police departments. They would all get together and they would buy a jet plane, or they would buy whatever else you need to defend the entire country. It'd be the same thing in the US. In the U.S., everyone in Texas, or most people in Texas, would, they're very into this stuff, and they would all pay. And in Massachusetts, they're a bunch of they don't really think that they need defense. Well, the U.S. People would go to whoever the bad guys are, Russia or whoever the bad guy, the Nazis, whoever it is, and say, look, if you bomb Massachusetts, we're not going to bother you. But you mess with Texas and we're going to kick your butt. I'm exaggerating this because there are obviously people in Texas who won't pay. In economics, this is called the free rider problem. Everyone's going to say, well, let the other guy do it. And I'm not going to do it. And this is one of the market failures. And here, Austrian economics disagrees with the mainstream. For the mainstream, there are such a thing as a market failure. One of them is monopoly, another is a public good, and defense is sometimes called a public good, and also, a lighthouse is a public good. And then there's a free rider problem, which is externalities. And the Austrian view is that there aren't any market failures. There's no such thing as a market failure. And the free rider problem is overcome by internalizing the externalities. I'm sorry to get a little technical on economics here, but the way we would do this is if you didn't subscribe to your local police force in Israel, you really couldn't live in Israel. Nobody's going to deal with you. And the national police or the national army, the IDF, instead of instead of a governmental IDF, it would be a private IDF comprised of the 10 local police forces in Israel, and they would amalgamate and do a better job, I think, of defending the country than the IDF does.
I think Danny wants to ask a question.
Hi, Walter.
Hello.
It's an honor to speak to you. You mentioned that you services which currently being performed publicly and could be replaced by private initiative, like military, firearms, and police. My question is, how does it fit the neighborhood effect principle by Milton Friedman, which claims that once you have a very good private service among a limited area, it doesn't consist for less developed areas, and then the crime rate could be much higher there and could arrive to your private door. So what's your take on that?
Danny, I'm sorry, I really didn't, when I answer a question, I want to be very clear on the question, and there was noise, and I didn't really get the question. Gilad, could you?
I think the question is what happens in poor neighborhoods that maybe don't have the funds to pay for adequate protection, whereas now with the state, blah, blah.
Good. Now I understand the question.
I think that was the question.
Well, I'll answer that because I understand that. I'm not going to answer Danny's question. Hopefully,
okay, fine.
it's translated Danny correctly. Let me repeat the question as well. Okay, it's all well and good. The police will protect people, but how about the poor? How will the poor get protection? And this, by the way, is an argument against everything in libertarianism. How about the poor? I mean, you say we want to privatize healthcare. How will the poor get healthcare? You say you want to privatize housing and no public housing. How will the poor get housing? Well, I have two answers for that. One, the poor in capitalist countries are richer than middle-class people in countries where they don't have free enterprise. Namely, free enterprise lifts all boats, including the poor boats. Poor people in the US have color TV, they have air conditioning, they have cars, they've got a lot of stuff. Whereas middle-class people in Venezuela or other countries that are socialist, they don't do as well as the poor. So one way that the poor will get protection is they'll be richer because of economic freedom. The second one is there's going to be private property everywhere. All the roads are going to be private in the full free enterprise situation. And the poor will be, the poor will get onto those roads because they'll be cheaper than they are now, because, the roads, we now call them freeways. They're not freeways, they're taxways. The poor are paying taxes. And the fees that the poor will pay to get onto a road will be lower than the taxes that they're paying, because government is less efficient than the market. Another thing is, well, how will the poor benefit from food? How will the poor get food if we don't give them food? Well, they'll be richer, and the prices of food will be cheaper if we don't have government interfering with agriculture. How will the poor get police protection? Well, every square inch of property under the free enterprise system will be privately owned. And I own a mall. Well, I want to protect everyone. And I don't know who's rich and who's poor, but my police in the shopping mall are going to protect everyone. So the poor will be able to be protected. And now I'm a landlord of a house. And there are poor people in my house, but I hired a local police department to keep the people in my house safe. Otherwise, I'm not going to have any tenants. So the poor will there'll be free riders in that sense, namely that they'll benefit from the fact that middle class and rich people want to be protected. And it's hard to tell who's rich and who's poor. Milton Friedman once said that the reason you can't tell who's rich and who's poor is because the way you tell is by their clothing. And clothing is one of the freest industries in the country. And therefore, the poor look like anyone else. It's the middle class kids that come with dungarees with holes in them. I don't know if they do that in Israel, but in the United States, upper middle class people have ratty clothes, and the poor have good clothes if they want them. So that would be my answer to Danny's question. We've only got a few more minutes, and Gilad promised me that there would be a question about slavery. Does anyone want to hear that, or should we just get the next person?
I have a feeling that you want to answer the question even if no one asks it. So,
I have like a similar question. Like, I'm not very similar, but I have another question.
Okay.
What do you think about the age limitations, like in alcohol or cigarettes?
Age limitations is another question that is very difficult. The way I usually answer that is, what is the statutory rape age? Well, we know that if you go to bed with a 5-year-old girl, you're a statutory rapist, even if she agrees, because 5-year-old girls are not capable of making any such agreements. On the other hand, if you go to bed with a 25-year-old woman and she agrees, well, whatever else you are, you're not a statutory rapist. Well, where do you draw the line? Should it be 15, 16, 17, 14, what? Any point you pick, suppose you pick 17. Well, there are girls who are 16 and a half who are more mature than girls who are 18. There's no one right answer emanating from libertarian theory, and there's no one right answer emanating from any theory. So whether it's statutory rape age or the age of consent or the age of where you can have alcohol, and you get anomalies. Like in the US, in order to have beer, you have to be 21, but you can be in the army at 18. So you have soldiers who are 19 who can't have a beer. I mean, that's a little crazy. But the answer that I give to these questions, there's no one right answer. You have to have some sort of agreement. And if you have a democracy, well, whatever the politicians who are duly elected, whatever they say, that's the age. And it keeps changing in different states. There's different ages. There are even cases at 13 where you can get married at 13. And, I think that's, my assessment is that's way too young for statutory rape or the age of consent. It should be more like 17 or 16 or something like that. But different cultures have different views. Not that I favor whatever every culture comes up with, because in India, they had this thing called sati, Suttee, which means when a man dies, when a husband dies, they put him on a funeral pyre, they burn his body, and they push the wife on. And this is not cool. This is not kosher. This is crazy. This is a violation of rights. And yet that was their culture. So I'm not a cultural relativist. I don't think every culture is equally valid. I think some cultures are better than other cultures. And happily, the British stopped the sati in India. Now, I'm not in favor of colonialism, but on this one issue, I think the British were quite right to stop the Indians from doing sati.
Next, and please try to ask quickly because we're running out of time.
Can I ask one question? It's one very specific question about small societies, whether and how they can work within an anarcho-capitalist society, like small society that decides to be socialist, for example, or any other differentials.
Okay, I'll answer that question, but I just wanted to mention that 3 or 4 people asked about the military. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to send to Gilad a whole bunch of readings on this stuff. And I'll ask Gilad to send it out to you people and take a peek at that. And then if you have any questions, email me about it. Okay, now for Meyer's question about socialism. See, one of the benefits of laissez-faire capitalism is you can have socialism in it, whereas you can't have capitalism in a socialist society. Take the kibbutz, the Israeli kibbutz. Now, I know the government subsidized them to some degree, but let's talk about a platonic kibbutz, where they get together and they all agree to share and they have egalitarianism. God bless them, they can do it. Let them pool their own resources and have socialism. Look, there are 2 definitions of socialism. One is government owns the means of production. Well, that would be incompatible with libertarianism. But another definition of socialism is from each to each, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. And you could do that in a kibbutz or a commune or the average family. The little girl in the family eats not in accordance with her ability to earn income, but in accordance with her needs. And the father and the mother, especially the father, go out and work, and they don't eat in accordance with their ability to earn income. They eat in accordance with their needs. So under the free society, you can have voluntary socialism. Whereas if you have a socialist country, you can't have private newspapers or private anything because you're now dealing with government property. So this is another talking point in favor of economic freedom. That under economic freedom, if you're a socialist of a certain type from each variety, you can be accommodated. Whereas under the socialist system, other people cannot be accommodated.
Next one, assuming Walter, we have some more time.
Hello, Walter.
Yes.
I noticed there is a bit of a disagreement between different libertarian speakers in regards to centralization versus decentralization. I see some libertarians argue for decentralization because supposedly it brings the power more closer into the state where each person has power on themselves. And on the other hand, I see libertarians argue for more centralization in the form of like larger than state unions like the EU, which limits state power from above. And I'm wondering what's your opinion about this agreement?
That's a very good question. The way I look at it is I'm neither a centralist or a decentralist. I'm a pragmatist, whatever works. For example, in the United States, with which I'm a lot more familiar than I am with Israel, and I hope I didn't screw up things when I mention Israel. In the United States, various states started legalizing marijuana. The federal government had a law against marijuana. First, they legalized it for medical purposes, then they legalized it for recreational purposes. And Oregon just legalized cocaine and heroin. And I favor legalization of all drugs, so I'm a decentralist there. On the other hand, Ronald Reagan once threatened New York City that if you keep your rent control, we're going to stop something, or we're going to get you. Well, I'm against rent control. I think rent control is a violation of rights. And here I was a centralist. So whatever is more libertarian, I favor. So I'm neither a decentralist or a centralist. It depends. Now, other things equal, ceteris paribus. If you don't know, then I'm a decentralist because, if you don't like living in New Jersey, it's easy to move to Pennsylvania. But if you don't like in the US, it's harder to move to Canada or Mexico or Israel or somewhere else. So other things equal, I'm a decentralist. But, if the EU can stop nationalism, that's good. But then the problem with the EU and the reason that Britain left the EU is they become their own government. So I would veer in the direction of decentralization. But if somehow it worked, then I'm a centralist.
Walter, do we have more time or?
One last question.
Okay.
Can I ask, please?
Sure, go ahead.
I have a bit of a side question. I hope it is okay. I would like to know who is your favorite non-libertarian philosopher and why?
That's a nasty question. You're a rotten kid. My favorite non-libertarian philosopher of political economy?
Yes.
That's a horrible question. I pride myself on not being stumped by questions. I don't know. I never thought of why would I favor I favor non-libertarian philosophers who don't talk about political economy. I like David Hume for his stuff on atheism. I'm an atheist. I got converted by David Hume, but he is a libertarian. I'm sorry. I really have no answer to that. I've never thought of a favorite non-libertarian. I guess a favorite maybe Chomsky. I don't know, because he's very good on foreign policy. Well, he's a little weak on Israel, but he's a sort of a Ron Paulian on foreign policy. Or I went to high school with Bernie Sanders. We were on the same track team, and he's very good on foreign policy. Again, not on Israel, but he's sort of Ron Paul. He wants to bring all the troops home, which I favor. But I'm sorry to go out on a fizzle here. I really haven't thought about that, and you got me stumped. I admit it. I admit defeat here.
Is this Walter, or do you have
one last? I'm going to answer on slavery. What you got?
Okay. I have a question actually.
My question was the slavery.
Okay.
Sorry, Amit.
Okay. So my question is, how do you propose that in an anarchistic society, we would prevent one company, let's say police or an army, from preventing through force other companies from competing in certain sectors? And the big question is, what's the difference compared to the current situation, where we can treat the current government as the company that prevents other from competing in these areas?
Okay. Well, look, we started a little late, so what the heck? But I do want to get off soon because I'm running out of steam. What would prevent the private defense agencies from fighting each other instead of fighting the enemy? Let's say the Arabs or some other group that wanted to stop Israel. Well, the way I answer this, and here I rely on Murray Rothbard and David Friedman. And again, a lot of the questions are coming from this, so I'm going to send a whole bunch of readings for you, people to look at. The way I approach this is think of A, B, C, D, and E. A is Albert, B is Bob, C is Charlie, D is David, and E is Edward. And let's suppose that A and E, Alan and Edward, get into a dispute. And what if they're law-abiding people, what they'll do is they'll each go to a private defense agency, and A goes to B, and A invites E to come to B, and E says, "What? B's your brother-in-law, or B is your friend. I'm not going to B. Let's go to D, David." And A says, "I'm not going to David because David's your mother or your cousin," and so they each go to their own defense agency. A goes to B and E goes to D. Now, there are four possibilities. One possibility is both defense agencies, B and D, Bob and David, agree with A, and that's the end of it, because when you go to a defense agency, you sign a contract with them and you're going to abide by whatever they say. And also, they've got all the guns, you've got no guns. So if both defense agencies agree with A, well, then A wins. And if both defense agencies agree with E, well, then E wins. Now, it's possible that B will agree with E and D will agree with A, but let's forget about that. Let's suppose that each one agrees with their buddy. Bob agrees with Alan, and David agrees with Edward. Well, now you have a problem because B and D might fight with each other. And what David Friedman and Murray Rothbard say about this is there'll be two kinds of defense agencies. One will be legitimate ones, and the other will be illegitimate ones. What's the difference? Well, the legitimate ones will sign a contract with each other that if ever we end up on the opposite sides of a dispute, we'll go to C, who I haven't mentioned, Charlie. We'll go to Charlie, or we'll pick a group of 15 people, and then a random number, we'll pick somebody, and he'll decide. And that'll be the Supreme Court. Those are legitimate courts, namely they anticipate this and they agree to be bound by somebody else. And look, next time A could be the Supreme Court or E could be the Supreme Court. And then there are illegitimate courts, and the illegitimate courts say my way or the highway, I'm always right. If you disagree with me, the hell with you, we'll fight. Well, now the point is that fighting is more expensive than mediating. And the illegitimate courts are going to fight with other illegitimate courts. And going to fight with legitimate courts. They'll fight with everybody. Whereas the legitimate courts are only going to fight with illegitimate courts. Namely, the illegitimate courts are going to be weeded out by the market process. And then there's also this thing that the pen is mightier than the sword. Now you think the pen, how could the pen be mightier than the sword? How big is the pen? Here is a pen. How big is this pen? The pen is, I don't know, 5 inches. How big is a sword? A sword is 5 feet or 3 feet or whatever the sword is. So you think that when the pen is dueling with the sword would win? No. The pen wins. Why does the pen win? Because the pen determines legitimacy. The pen determines which way the swords are pointing. And everyone knows that this defense agency is an illegitimate defense agency, and they're probably going to be killed off right before they get to fight anyone. So that would be my answer to that. And I'm going to answer the slavery question whether you people like it or not. Because Gilad said that, and that'll be the last question, and I'm going to get off. Okay, so what's going on with slavery?
Would
Well,
you
look,
like me to ask it though?
I'm sorry, Shelley?
Would you like me to ask the slavery question though? I was the one that Gilad was telling. Yeah.
No.
Okay.
Let's imagine someone actually asked the question, and let's Walter answer.
You could ask that question, but you have to ask that question.
Well, I was wondering about you wrote about voluntary slavery and the distinction between voluntary slavery and non-voluntary slavery. And then specifically, you said that voluntary slavery is okay. I would disagree with that, not in the sense that voluntary slavery is okay, but in the sense that voluntary slavery does not exist. But I would love for you to go on that in more detail.
Okay, thanks for the question. If I said voluntary slavery is okay, I misspoke. What I should have said is, if I made that mistake, I should have said voluntary slavery should be legal. And by the way, here I disagree with Murray Rothbard, and I disagree with most libertarians. The only libertarian who agrees with me on this that I found, well, there were one or two others, but Robert Nozick agrees with me, which is pretty good. He's a pretty famous libertarian, but I'm in the distinct minority. Well, look, actual slavery is an abomination. Actual slavery is perhaps the second worst violation of rights. The first one would be mass murder. Actual slavery is an abomination. And, you know, Black people were enslaved in the US until 1865. Jews were enslaved in Egypt. Thomas Sowell, I'm a big fan of his, mentions that slavery has been in every country in every century. People enslave each other, and it's just horrible. It's a clear and present violation of rights. But what about voluntary slavery? Is there such a thing as voluntary slavery? Well, now here's the example I use to illustrate this. My son, assume, God forbid this is true, my son has a horrible disease and he's going to die, and it's going to cost $20 million to save his life. And I don't have anything like $20 million. And Gilad has long wanted me to be his slave. Gilad will make me come to Israel. I'll pick cotton for him. I'll give economic lessons. And if he doesn't like the lessons or the cotton picking, he'll whip me, and he can even kill me. Gilad's not a nice guy, but he's very rich. And what I do is I make a deal with Gilad. I say, Gilad, give me the 20 million. I'll give it to my son's doctors and I'll save his life. And then I'll come and I'll be your slave. And with every voluntary action, and this is an Austrian view, not a mainstream view, every voluntary action is beneficial in the ex ante sense. When I bought this shirt, I valued the shirt more than the $10 it cost me. Now, ex post, maybe I changed my mind, who knows? But ex ante, I valued that shirt more than $10. Well, how did I make a profit? I made a profit because I valued my son's life more than my freedom. Sue me. I value his life more than my freedom. Those of you that have children can understand where I'm coming from. I value my son's life more than my freedom. If it came to my freedom versus his life, I'd vote for his life. Gilad also made a profit because he valued my servitude more than 20 million. So is this a legitimate deal? I say it's a legitimate deal, like any other deal. And now Gilad is whipping me, and I call upon Danny, who's a private policeman. I say, Danny, look, Gilad is whipping me. This is assault and battery. Get him to stop. And Gilad pulls out a piece of paper, which I sign, and he shows to Danny. And Danny says, you know, Block, you can't object. You sold yourself into slavery. This is called a specific performance contract. And I got into a big debate with, who is it, Stefan Kinsella, who is another magnificent libertarian, but I think he's wrong on this issue. And the example I gave him was, I'm a tightrope walker. I walk on a tightrope, you know, here's a rope. I'll illustrate a rope. There's my rope. And I walk on this rope, and I'm 100 feet up in the air. And I hire Eliam. I hire Eliam to hold a net under me. And I get out on the rope, and Eliam has got the net. And in the middle of my performance, Eliam says, well, you know, I've got better things to do. I'm leaving. And I've got a gun, and I say, Eliam, you leave, I'll shoot you. Because I have a contract with him. He's supposed to hold the net. And it's a specific performance. Namely, I don't want, you see, like if I hire Eliam to sing at my wedding and he doesn't sing, well, you know, maybe he owes me some money, or maybe he signed a bond that if he doesn't show up at the wedding, he has to pay me $1,000. That's fine. But I want specific performance. I want to, if Eliam promised to sing at my wedding and he declines and he signed a specific performance contract, I should be able to shoot him if he doesn't sing at my wedding. Now, this is very unpopular, but I think that it follows from the logic of libertarianism. That specific performance, there are two kinds of contracts. One is specific performance, and if you don't perform, you're a criminal. And the other is, if you don't perform, you have to lose your bond, or you lose your reputation, or whatever. So
wait, sorry, Walter, the contract you signed with the singer in your wedding includes a sanction of him getting shot, or is this a sanction that you can invent as you see fit?
Either way, you can have whatever contract you want. If I really felt it was important for him to sing at my wedding, I wouldn't make him post a bond, or I wouldn't rely on his losing reputation as a singer. I would say, look, if you don't show up, I'm going to shoot you. And he signed it, I can shoot him, and I'm not a murderer. Any more than if Gilad kills me, because you're allowed to kill slaves. Look, they killed slaves. When the owner kills a slave, it's like the owner killing a horse, or killing a cow. The cow and the horse have no rights. The slave has no rights. And I'm saying I gave up my rights. Why did I give up my rights? Because I wanted to save my son's life. And if you don't allow me to have this contract, my son dies. I don't want my son to die. So look, that's all I have to say on that. But, you know, I've written a lot about voluntary slavery. I've written a lot, and other people have written a lot about the military. So I will send Gilad a whole bunch of stuff, and he'll distribute it among you. And then, you know, maybe in a month or two, we can do this again if you think it's worthwhile, and we can get more deeply into some of these questions.
Absolutely. Walter, thanks very, very much for your time. You've been speaking about for 75 minutes. So again, thank you very much. Yeah, I actually do expect that we're going to have this call again. Because look, I have another 5 questions or 10 questions that I couldn't ask. So even just for me, I'd like to have this call again. So I'm sure for many other people here. So again, Walter, thank you very much. And thanks everyone for joining. It was a great 75 minutes.
For this.
I have a question. I have a question for you. I'm able to get the first season of The Good Cop, but there are like 6 or 7 seasons, and I can't get the other seasons of The Good Cop. Somebody email me and tell me how to do that. Take care. I'm going to get off.